I watched his smile freeze in real time when my husband looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." 25 years of arrogance collapsed in that single sentence. And in that moment, I realized some. Revenge doesn't require shouting. Sometimes, the most devastating payback is indifference. Asterisk if you've ever been underestimated, mocked, or treated like you'd never amount to anything, hit like. Subscribe, and stay with me because this story isn't about yelling or fighting back. It's about winning so thoroughly that the people who hurt you stop mattering at all. Now let me take you back, because the moment that shattered him didn't start that night. It started decades earlier, in a place where reputations are born and scars quietly grow. High school. I went to a small private college prep school where everyone knew everyone. 72 kids in our graduating class, no massive cliques, no invisible kids. You could be an academic one day, an athlete the next, a theater nerd on Friday night. It was the kind of place adults romanticize, safe, intimate, supportive. And for the most part, it was. But even in small environments, there's always someone who feeds off making others feel smaller. For me and my best friend John, who would later become my husband, school was fine. Not magical. Not traumatic. Just fine, except for Tom. Tom wasn't a stereotypical bully. He didn't shove people into lockers or steal lunch money. He was worse in a quieter way. He specialized in humiliation disguised as humor. The kind that made teachers sigh and classmates laugh nervously while you stood there pretending not to care. He targeted the smart kids, the thoughtful ones. The ones who didn't need to be loud to feel important. John was brilliant even back then. Not show-off brilliant, quiet, focused, absorbed in ideas. I was similar. We kept our heads down, did our work, and dreamed about futures far beyond that building. Tom hated that. Or maybe he envied it. Either way, he made sure we felt it. He'd pull pranks that were never funny if you were on the receiving end, fake party invitations and out in my name, complete with my parents' address. Just to watch me panic when strangers started texting. Rumors started casually, with a grin. Once, he told half the school he'd seen John making out with a girl who was openly a lesbian, knowing exactly what kind of ridicule that would unleash. When confronted, he'd smirk and say, "Relax. It's just a joke." That phrase, "just a joke," is how cowards avoid accountability. John never reacted the way Tom wanted. No outbursts. No public anger. He absorbed it, stored it somewhere deep, and kept moving forward. I used to ask him if it bothered him. He'd shrug and say, "People like that peak early." At the time, I thought he was just coping. I didn't realize he was predicting the future. After graduation, life did what it always does. It separated the performers from the builders. John founded his company in his late 20s. I watched it grow from late-night brainstorming sessions and ramen dinners into something real, something valuable. He didn't chase attention. He chased excellence. And excellence has a way of drawing attention whether you want it or not. Years later, his success wasn't just financial. He became deeply involved in local charities, education initiatives, community development. When he spearheaded the construction of a STEM center for multiple schools including our old high school, his name was placed on the building, not because he demanded it, but because others insisted. He had become someone people trusted, someone people respected. With that came visibility, alumni newsletters, local news features, social media presence managed by professionals because John didn't care about being online famous. He cared about impact. The irony wasn't lost on me. The kid who never raised his voice now had a platform louder than anyone who ever mocked him. Tom, on the other hand, followed a very different trajectory. And thanks to social media, I unfortunately had a front row seat. Every few years, he reinvented himself, first as a wannabe rapper, then a DJ. Then a car salesman posting motivational quotes next to leased luxury cars, then real estate investor. Posts that made my skin crawl because I work in construction and could smell the fraud through the screen. Then some private equity-sounding nonsense that never named real clients. And finally, crypto, always promising secret knowledge, always selling the illusion of success rather than the substance. He messaged me more than once, investment opportunity, limited time. Thought of you. I never responded. Silence, I learned, is often the clearest message. So when the invitation for our 25-year reunion came round, I almost didn't go. High school reunions have a way of reopening doors best left closed. But John agreed to host part of it at our property, a renovated barn on several acres, and I could tell he wanted to do it. Not out of nostalgia, out of closure. The night of the event, about 50 alumni showed up, plus spouses and kids running barefoot across the grass. There were string lights, laughter, the sound of glasses clinking. It was warm, safe, and John and I didn't roam. We sat on a side patio, with close friends, drinks in hand, watching the kids chase each other and talking about life as it actually was, not the curated version people like Tom sold online. That's when I saw him. Tom approached with confidence that hadn't been earned, smile wide, shoulders back, scanning the group like a salesman sizing up potential clients. He went straight for John. Of course he did. At first, it was polite. Small talk, congratulations, compliments that felt rehearsed. Then, without missing a beat, he launched into it. You know, with your success, you could be making way more money in crypto. I felt my jaw tighten. 25 years later, and he still hadn't learned how to read a room. John didn't snap. He didn't bristle. He simply tilted his head slightly and said, calmly, I'm sorry, I didn't catch who you're here with. Is your wife one of our classmates? They're shifted. Tom blinked, laughed once, too loudly. No man, I'm Tom. Tom ________. We were classmates. Don't you remember? I used to razz you. I watched John's face carefully. No anger, no recognition. Just polite confusion. He scratched his head and said, not really. I think I have a pretty good memory of our class, but I don't remember you at all. That's when I knew. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate, controlled, surgical. And Tom felt it. We hadn't even reached the real revenge yet. The confusion on Tom's face didn't disappear after John said he didn't remember him. It lingered, stretched, and slowly curdled into something uglier. I could almost see the mental gears grinding as Tom tried to reconcile what had just happened with the version of himself he carried around in his head, the one where everyone still knew his name, where he was unforgettable, where he mattered. That split second of silence felt louder than any insult could have. It was the sound of a fragile ego cracking in real time, and I knew instinctively that this wasn't over. Men like Tom never walk away quietly when their relevance is questioned. They circle back. They always do. John, on the other hand, was perfectly calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that comes not from ignorance, but from control. He didn't lean forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even sound annoyed. He simply shifted the conversation away from Tom like someone moving a coffee cup that was placed too close to the edge of a table, and when he casually waved Ashley over, the event planner who had been helping manage the flow of guests, I felt a tight knot of anticipation settle in my chest. Not fear, not anger. Something closer to satisfaction that hadn't fully bloomed yet. Ashley approached with the polished smile of someone who knew how to handle delicate situations without creating scenes. John didn't embarrass Tom directly. He didn't accuse him. He didn't challenge him. He framed it as a misunderstanding, which somehow made it worse. He said he was approached all the time because of his business, that he had to be careful, that this was his home and a private event. Then he asked Ashley, gently, to verify the guest list. That was it. No aggression. No drama. Just procedure. Just boundaries. Just power exercised quietly. Tom bristled immediately. I watched his shoulders tense as Ashley gestured for him to follow her. His lips pressed together, then pulled into that tight, performative smile people use when they know they're losing ground but refuse to acknowledge it. He muttered something under his breath, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, and walked off with an exaggerated swagger that screamed insecurity. As soon as he was out of earshot, the tension at our table dissolved. John sat back down beside me and gave me a small wink, the kind that said everything without saying anything at all. It's unfortunate, he said casually to the group, lifting his drink. I have to be careful. Someone nearby chimed in, clearly trying to smooth things over. Yeah, that was Tom. He was in our class. John shrugged, genuinely uninterested. How? I must not have interacted with him much, and just like that, the subject changed. Sports, kids, travel, life. Tom ceased to exist in the conversation, and I realized something then that felt strangely profound. The opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference, and indifference is devastating. About 20 minutes passed. I almost forgot about Tom entirely, which I suspect was the most painful part for him. When he returned, it wasn't alone. He brought backup, a former classmate, who had helped organize the reunion, someone who'd been close to him back in high school, someone who still remembered him the way he desperately wanted to be remembered. She approached our group with a tight smile, that polite but tense expression people wear when they're about to mediate something awkward. I hear you said you don't remember Tom, she said. Her tone carefully neutral. He was in our class all 4 years. He played on the football team. I felt the moment stretch again, like the room itself was holding its breath. This was Tom's second attempt. His appeal to witnesses, his demand to be validated. John didn't apologize. He didn't backtrack. He didn't suddenly pretend recognition for the sake of politeness. He simply looked at her, thoughtful for a beat, and said, I'm sorry. Sometimes people just fail to leave an impression on me. His voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was factual. Almost kind, which somehow made it infinitely more brutal. Then he smiled, warmly, genuinely, and added, I hope you enjoy my home and have a lovely weekend. And with that, he turned away, not from Tom, from the entire situation. He stood up, placed a hand gently on my back, and said to me, let's go check on the important people. Make sure the kids are having fun. If you missed it, that was the point. The kids were the important people. Not old grudges, not high school hierarchies. Not men who spent their lives chasing attention instead of building something real. As we walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The silence Tom was left standing in. The realization sinking in that no one was coming to rescue his pride. That the world had moved on without him. That the people he once mocked had grown, succeeded, and built lives so full that they didn't have room for him anymore. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from John. 2 words, simple, perfect. That was fun, and in that moment, I understood something deeply and completely. The most powerful revenge isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't gloat. It doesn't even acknowledge the person who wronged you. The most powerful revenge is becoming so secure, so fulfilled, and so far removed from the past that the people who hurt you fade into irrelevance. And Tom, he didn't just lose a conversation that night. He lost his place in the story. Asterisk people assume revenge always looks explosive, that it has to be loud, public, humiliating. They imagine raised voices, accusations, someone storming off in tears. But what most people don't understand, what I didn't fully understand until that night, is that the most devastating revenge is the kind that unfolds quietly, inside someone's own head. Long after the moment has passed. That's what happened to Tom, and I know it because I recognized the signs. I had seen them before, just never so clearly. After John and I walked away, the night continued around us like nothing unusual had happened. Music played softly through outdoor speakers, kids ran past with sticky fingers and flushed cheeks, old friends laughed about memories that had nothing to do with hierarchy or popularity. Life moved forward, effortlessly, and Tom stood frozen. In a moment he couldn't escape. I noticed him out of the corner of my eye later, lingering near the bar, nursing a drink he wasn't really drinking. His posture had changed, the swagger was gone. His shoulders slumped slightly, like gravity had increased just for him. He kept scanning the crowd, searching for eye contact, for recognition, for something, anything that would restore the version of himself he believed in. But no one rushed to him. No one asked him to join their conversation. No one seemed particularly interested in reminding John who he was, and that was the real punishment. Because for someone like Tom, being disliked would have been easier. Being confronted would have given him something to fight against. He thrived on friction, on attention, even negative attention. What he couldn't tolerate, what he was completely unequipped to handle, was being erased. Not literally, of course, but emotionally, socially, psychologically. I realized then that Tom had come to this reunion with a script already written in his head. He had imagined reconnecting, name-dropping, positioning himself as a peer to successful people. Maybe even pitching an opportunity to someone with real money this time. He expected admiration, or at the very least recognition. Instead, he was treated like background noise. Like someone who hadn't mattered enough to be remembered. And once that realization settled in, there was no fixing it. I watched him try. He laughed a little too loudly at jokes he wasn't part of. He inserted himself into conversations, only to be met with polite nods and quick exits. He mentioned his latest venture, something vague involving digital assets and early adoption, but without the captive audience he was used to online, it fell flat. People smiled, nodded, and drifted away. The room wasn't hostile. It was indifferent, and that indifference wrapped around him like a fog, suffocating and inescapable. What made it worse was John's complete lack of follow-up. There was no clarification, no second glance, no whispered explanation to smooth things over. John didn't feel the need to defend himself or justify his memory. He simply moved on, fully present with the people who mattered to him now. That kind of confidence can't be faked. And it sends a brutal message. You are not worth my emotional energy. At one point, I overheard Tom trying to explain the situation to another classmate. I mean, we weren't close, but we definitely knew each other, he said, his voice tight, defensive. I used to mess with him a bit. You remember how it was? The other person nodded vaguely, clearly uncomfortable, and changed the subject. That was when I saw it, the flicker of panic in Tom's eyes, not anger. Not embarrassment, panic. Because deep down, he knew the truth. He knew that if someone like John, someone so detail-oriented, so thoughtful, so grounded, didn't remember him, it wasn't because of a memory lapse. It was because Tom had never actually mattered in the ways that count. He had made noise, not impact. He had chased visibility, not substance. And noise fades, substance endures. As the night wore on, I thought about high school. About how powerful Tom must have felt back then, believing he was shaping narratives, defining people, leaving marks. I wondered if he ever considered that those moments, so significant to him, barely registered to the people he targeted, or maybe they did register, but only as motivation, as fuel, as proof of what not to become. I didn't feel joy watching him unravel. Not exactly. What I felt was something calmer, cleaner. A sense of balance being restored. This wasn't cruelty, this was consequence. No one orchestrated his downfall. No one set out to embarrass him. He simply collided with a reality he could no longer manipulate. When we eventually left that night, the sky was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a long, emotionally charged day. As we walked to our car, I asked John if he felt bad. He shook his head gently. No, he said. I just don't feel anything about it at all. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what had happened. Tom didn't lose because he was rejected. He lost because he was irrelevant. And irrelevance is the one thing someone like him cannot survive. Somewhere inside him, a story he had told himself for decades finally collapsed. The idea that he was unforgettable, that he had power over others, that he could always talk his way into importance. That night proved otherwise, and there was nothing he could sell, spin, or promote to undo it. The reunion ended, life went on, but I know without a doubt that Tom carried that moment home with him, into the quiet, into the mirror, into the long hours where self-delusion gets harder to maintain, and that realization, that slow-burning awareness that the people he once mocked had surpassed him so completely they didn't even remember him, would haunt him for longer than any public humiliation ever could, because the cruelest truth of all is this: you don't get revenge by destroying someone, you get revenge by outgrowing them. What stayed with me most after that night wasn't Tom's reaction, it was John's absence of one. That calm, that emotional neutrality, lingered in my mind for days afterward because it revealed something profound about how power actually works. Real power doesn't rush to defend itself. It doesn't argue its credentials. It doesn't chase validation. It simply exists, steady and undeniable. While everything fragile around it eventually collapses under its own weight, growing up, we're taught that success is loud, that it announces itself, that people who make it look a certain way, talk a certain way, dominate rooms and conversations. Tom embodied that belief perfectly. His entire adult life was built on projection, on appearing successful before he ever became it, on convincing others and himself that momentum was the same thing as progress. He chased admiration the way some people chase oxygen, not realizing that admiration gained without substance evaporates the moment it's tested. John was the opposite. Always had been. Even in high school, when Tom was busy being noticed, John was busy becoming capable. Back then, that difference didn't mean much socially, but adulthood has a way of sorting people ruthlessly. Over time, attention seekers exhaust their audience, while builders quietly accumulate trust, credibility, and influence. The reunion wasn't a showdown, it was a reveal. A moment where the contrast became impossible to ignore. I thought about how Tom must have felt driving home that night, replaying every second on a loop. The way John's face didn't light up with recognition. The way no one rushed to correct him. The way the room didn't shift in his favor no matter how hard he tried to steer it. People like Tom don't reflect easily, but moments like that force reflection whether they want it or not. When the noise fades and the audience disperses, there's nowhere left to hide from the truth, and the truth is brutal. Popularity is borrowed, character is owned. I realized something else too, something that surprised me. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. John didn't win by humiliating Tom. He won because he didn't need to engage at all. The power dynamic had flipped so completely that Tom's presence no longer mattered. And that's a terrifying realization for someone who has spent their entire life trying to matter through performance rather than purpose. In high school, Tom needed an audience because that's where his power came from. Without people reacting, laughing, cringing, whispering, he had nothing. John never needed an audience. He needed time. Time to grow, time to build. Time to outpace the version of himself Tom tried to freeze him into decades ago. By the time they met again, they weren't even playing the same game. That night, John didn't just forget Tom. He transcended him. And that's the part people rarely talk about. Growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like disinterest. Sometimes it looks like choosing where to place your energy with ruthless clarity. John chose his family, his friends. The kids running across the lawn, the life he had. Built deliberately, patiently, without shortcuts. Tom chose noise, and noise, eventually, becomes silence. The most telling moment came later. Long after guests had left and the lights were turned off, John and I sat together. Exhausted but content. And I asked him something I hadn't realized I was holding onto. I asked if any part of him remembered the old insults, the pranks, the rumors, the subtle cruelty. He thought for a moment, then shook his head slowly. I remember that someone tried to make me feel small, he said. I just don't remember who. That sentence hit harder than anything else that night, because it confirmed what I had begun to understand. Healing isn't about closure with the people who hurt you. It's about reaching a point where they no longer occupy space in your identity. Tom had defined himself against others his entire life. John had defined himself by what he created. And creation always outlives comparison. Some people peak early and spend the rest of their lives trying to convince the world they're still at the top. Others rise slowly and steadily. Until one day they look around and realize the people who once towered over them are nowhere to be seen. Not because they were defeated but because they were surpassed. That reunion wasn't a victory lap. It was a quiet confirmation. A reminder that dignity compounds, that consistency compounds, that integrity compounds, and that eventually, without you lifting a finger, life itself separates those who were loud from those who were lasting. Tom walked away that night with a bruise no one could see but him. A fracture in the story he told himself about who he was. And those fractures don't heal easily because they're not inflicted by others. They're revealed by reality. And reality doesn't apologize. There's a strange quiet that comes After moments like that, not the awkward kind, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that settles in your chest once something unresolved finally loosens its grip on you. In the days after the reunion, I found myself replaying the night not obsessively, not with adrenaline, but with clarity. Like rereading an old chapter of your life and realizing it no longer hurts the way it used to. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just John's moment, it was mine too. And maybe it was for anyone who's ever been dismissed, underestimated, or treated like a punchline by someone who mistook cruelty for confidence. For years, I had carried small, quiet memories from high school. Nothing dramatic, just moments where I felt unseen. Moments where someone like Tom decided who mattered and who didn't, based on volume instead of value. I didn't think those moments affected me anymore. I told myself they were insignificant. But seeing Tom that night, seeing how desperately he needed recognition, how fragile his confidence really was, put everything into perspective. The power he thought he had back then was borrowed, temporary, propped up by an audience that eventually grew up and moved on. What struck me most was how little effort it took for reality to correct the imbalance. No confrontation, no speeches, no revenge fantasies fulfilled in dramatic fashion. Just time, just growth. Just becoming someone so rooted in your own life that the people who once tried to define you no longer have access to your emotional space. That's the kind of justice no one warns you about. Because it doesn't feel like justice while you're waiting for it. It just feels like patience, like endurance, like choosing the long road when shortcuts are tempting. I realized that Tom wasn't punished that night by John's words, he was punished by John's life. By the proof standing quietly behind every choice John had made, a stable family, meaningful work, genuine respect. Not the loud, flashy kind that needs constant reinforcement, but the deep kind that exists whether anyone is watching or not. Tom spent decades trying to look successful. John spent decades becoming successful. When those two paths finally crossed, again, the difference was impossible to ignore. And here's the part that stays with me the most. John didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't even feel relieved. He felt nothing at all about Tom. And that's what made it final. That's what made it irreversible. Because the opposite of pain isn't pride, it's peace. And peace comes when someone no longer has the power to disturb you. I think a lot of people wait for an apology that will never come, or an acknowledgement that might not happen. They imagine a future moment where the person who hurt them finally admits they were wrong. But life doesn't always give us that. Sometimes it gives us something better. It gives us distance, it gives us perspective, it gives us a life so full that the past loses its authority. Tom left that reunion with something he couldn't market, spin, or escape. The realization that he had been left behind, not out of malice, but out of irrelevance. And that realization is devastating in a way no insult could ever be. Because insults can be dismissed, reality can't. I don't know what Tom tells himself now. Maybe he rewrote the story. Maybe he convinced himself John was pretending. Maybe he doubled down on his online persona to drown out the doubt. But I do know this. For the first time, the mirror probably asked him questions he didn't have answers to. And that's a reckoning no one else can interfere with. As for us, life went on. Kids grew. Projects evolved. The world kept turning. And somewhere along the way, that old high school weight I didn't realize I was still carrying finally fell away. Not because someone apologized, not because someone suffered, but because the narrative changed. We weren't the kids anymore. We were the proof. So if you're listening to this and thinking about someone who made you feel small, let me tell you something that took me a long time to learn. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to live well, consistently, authentically, with intention. Time has a way of exposing what's real and what was just noise. And when the day comes, because it often does, when someone from your past looks at you and realizes they no longer recognize the version of you they once underestimated, that moment will speak louder than any revenge you could ever plan. That's not bitterness. That's balance. And that's the kind of ending that lasts. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone you've outgrown or a chapter you've quietly closed, Take a second to hit like and subscribe for more real, emotionally powerful stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment where silence said more than confrontation ever could? Because sometimes the strongest response is simply becoming unforgettable to yourself while forgetting the people who never truly mattered.